I'm going to go on a bit of a rant today. I'm going to talk basically about a subject that I'm very passionate about, and has to do with politics, and specifically the challenges of fiscal policy within the political landscape we exist in today. I'm going to be talking about the Biden student loan forgiveness plan, which in my opinion should be better called the Biden let's throw some good money after bad plan, because that's how I view it. I have to give you this disclaimer. I absolutely detest what the government has devolved into. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't detest the people in government. I detest what the system of government has become. You see, at our founding, we were a nation that basically called upon its citizens to do their civic duty by representing us within the different levels of government, whether you're talking about local government, state government, federal government. But it was a civic duty with the understanding that once you were done that duty, you returned back to the life you had before you got into politics. But what we have nowadays is we have these perpetual politicians, these individuals that are literally in the business of representing other people within government. That creates a problem because there's no prerequisite to being financially literate before getting into politics. We have basically this population that are making decisions about other people's money. I don't know about you, but I get so frustrated when I'm watching the news, seeing what they're going to be doing with my money. My name is Edward Collins, and for the past 25 plus years, I've been building and scaling my own businesses and helping other business owners just like you do the exact same thing by essentially helping you work towards this state of financial freedom. And I do that by teaching you the secrets of wealth creation, wealth accumulation, and wealth protection. And I'm so adamant about this subject because the sheer idiocy of the decisions that are being made in Washington, D.C. that lately is just so frustrating. And it really doesn't matter what political party you're in right now, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, and it doesn't really even matter who's in charge in government. I argue this: if you are sitting down in front of a news broadcast, whether it's Fox News or CNN, if you're watching a news broadcast about decisions that Washington, D.C. is making with money, I have to imagine that you get frustrated. I mean, I get frustrated all the time when I'm watching the news. And that frustration is born out of an understanding that you work hard for what you have, and the government seems to just be doing whatever it wants for no realistically logical reason when the logic has to do with us as the people. The logic definitely makes sense if you're talking about how does that politician stay in power? What types of favors can they do for their constituent? What types of incentives can they give to people who potentially will vote next election day? That makes all the sense of the world. But when it comes to actual understanding what is in the best interest of the people, I argue that there's very little logic that can be found in Washington, D.C. these days. Let me break it down by actually exploring more of the Biden student loan forgiveness plan. The way the plan works, it's basically going to cover the student loan debt, make some funds available to pay off or forgive a certain amount of student loan debt. So if you were a Pell Grant recipient while you were accumulating student loans, you have the ability to get up to $20,000 of that student loan forgiveness. If you were not a Pell Grant recipient, it's up to $10,000. Again, there's going to be some guidelines with regard to earnings. You can't earn more than $125,000 in order to get this grant. And the reality is, when you actually add up all of the numbers, it's probably going to impact somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40 to 50 million people who are going to have all, or at least a significant portion of their student loans forgiven. When you actually do the calculus, that's going to total more than $300 billion. That's billion dollars. That's a lot of money. And the challenge is the government doesn't have $300 billion just sitting on the sidelines ready to deploy for this endeavor. It actually has to come up with that money, and it's not currently budgeted for. So that means they're going to have to go out to the universe at large and figure out how to come up with that money. And realistically speaking, they have one of two ways to do it. They either are going to tax the population in order to cover that amount of money, or they're going to have to borrow it. I argue that regardless of what choice they make, everyone's going to pay. Why? Because both avenues lead to higher cost for you and me. It's either higher cost at April 15th, meaning you have to write a larger tax bill, or it's inflationary. Let me explain what I mean by that. You see, when the government spends money, makes a decision to spend money, it does go first and foremost to tax its population, but it has never, at least in recent years, been able to tax the population to a level that matches the spending it has on an annual basis. So there's always this shortfall. So what it does next is it goes out to other nations around the world and says, hey, by the way, are you willing to lend us money so we can borrow money from you, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, meaning we will definitely repay you at some point in the future. And don't get me wrong, a number of nations do definitely lend us money because it makes a lot of sense for their specific fiscal management, their actual monetary decisions that are made on the government level. But even that doesn't always meet the amount of money that the government needs in order to operate. So what they do next is they go out to the population of the world and say, hey, by the way, anyone who wants to lend us money, we'll issue you these treasuries. And they come in various durations, 10 years, 30 years, etc. And individual people then are essentially loaning the government money in order to operate, when again, it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government to repay those debt instruments. But even then, they don't always meet the need of what their spending is in a given year. So then they go to the lender of last resort, and that is the Federal Reserve Bank. Let me dispel any notions that you have regarding the Federal Reserve Bank, because the Federal Reserve Bank is neither federal, because it's not owned by the government. It is not a reserve, because they do not keep capital on the sidelines in any vaults, if you will. And it is not a bank. You and I cannot walk into the Federal Reserve Bank and open up an account. But they are a lender of last resort. And what the government does is they go to the Federal Reserve Bank and say, hey, by the way, we don't have enough money to meet our spending for this particular year. We've taxed our people. We've borrowed from the universe of people who are willing to lend to us, but we still need more. Will you lend us some money? And the Federal Reserve Bank says, yes, I'd be happy to do that. And how do they do that? They basically acquire debt instruments from the government, meaning they pick up treasuries and put it on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And in exchange for that, they print more money. They make more money available and into the system, and the government then uses that money to basically operate the government. But that process of printing more money through a borrowing event means that there's more money now available to the universe of spenders. Meaning individuals can then go out to the marketplace and borrow money because interest rates are lower. They could borrow money for buying houses, buying cars, buying equipment as a business owner, reinvesting in their business. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to be able to do all that at low cost, but there is actually a larger cost that society bears, and that is the cost of inflation. Because when there's more money in a system, that spurs demand, and inflation is a product of supply and demand. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of other variables that go into a calculus, if you will, of inflation, but to keep it extremely simple, that's essentially what it is, supply and demand. If you have a limited supply of a good, but high demand for that good, the price of the good goes up. If you have low demand for a supply of a good, that price goes down, whether it's a good or a service. That's simply how inflation works. But if you put more money into a system, you are artificially inflating demand. You're making the demand higher for that good or service. And over the course of the past 2+ years, there really hasn't been a significant amount of growth that's happened within the economy, meaning there hasn't been more goods and services that are created, more so than in prior years. So the amount of goods or services have been relatively static. I'd argue a little bit down, but relatively static. So you have more money competing for the same amount of goods and services, it's logical that the cost of those services go up. Now, here's where we get into this pickle, if you will. The government have made a decision that they want to spend even more money to the tune of $300 billion. And that just means that they're going to have to come up with a way of dealing with those costs. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not going to happen overnight, but it's going to happen. And that means you and I are going to be the ones footing the bill, because the government, they don't make their own money. They take it from you and me. That's how it works. So if you're trying to figure out what your next steps are, how to deal with this scenario, the first and foremost thing you should be doing is figuring out how can you personally become more financially literate. Because it's only going to be based on a financially literate populace that we start making really fully informed decisions as a voting body. Again, I don't want to necessarily talk about any one political side here. What I am is saying this: no matter what, I think if you are better informed with regard to financial literacy topics, you'll be better informed to making the right decision at the ballot box. Regardless, I wish you well. If you like this, I strongly implore you to hit that subscribe button, because the information that I'm going to be sharing in the weeks and months ahead, you're not going to want to miss. I look forward to seeing you there. Bye for now. It's a little bit of a different take, but so